Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to address an interesting question I've received by a couple of the members of PCU. And the question was, after e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop c4, can or should black play knight e4 in this position? It certainly leads to a very sharp and very exciting game, and it seems playable to me. According to the theory standing today, White's most ambitious and best option right now is to play queen h5, which I'll talk about for most of the lesson. However, let's first talk about the idea of the move. Well, the basis of the combination is that if the white knight captures back, then black would play d5, and this is a very typical pattern that is very common in many king-pawn openings. Right now, black is forking the white bishop and knight. If one moves away, the other one could be captured. Except if the bishop would move to b5, giving a check, then black has to be careful how to react to that, and the only correct way to answer that is to play c6, making sure there are still two white pieces under attack. On the other hand, it would be not good to block with the bishop, because then bishop would capture bishop with a check, and the knight would be freely run away, maintaining the material advantage. So going back to the position after d5, white could play bishop d3, protecting the knight, but even though the material balance would be equal at this stage, black wouldn't have any problems whatsoever. So let's go back again to the situation after black just captured a pawn on e4. Another typical choice here for white would be to play bishop f7 to give up the bishop for a pawn, but strip black from the right of castling. So now we have again material balance. However, black has the pair of bishops, which means that black has still both bishops, while white only has one of them. That typically means that black is stronger on the light squares, which is quite important in this position, not necessarily because of the fact that the black bishop is about to do something immediate, but more importantly for the fact that the black king cannot be attacked that easily, as if white would have had a light squared bishop still on the board. At this stage, white is threatening to play queen h5 on the next move. However, luckily for black, it is their turn, and black can and should right now play d5, immediately attacking white's knight. So if now white continues with a check with queen h5, the king can just move to g8 safely. And otherwise, if the knight moves away, for example, back to c3, it's probably also a smart thing to do to retreat the king to g8. And then later play g6, bishop g7, perhaps even h6, king h7, and get the rook out. What is going for black is the knight's control of the center and the pair of bishops. And theories so far have shown that white's attack is not successful in this case. Let's go back to the position after knight e4 and look a little bit at the interesting situation that can arise after white plays queen h5. Well, let's look at this situation. White is immediately threatening to checkmate on f7, so black must do something about it. Playing g6 is not sufficient because the white queen will capture on e5 with a check, attacking black's rook, and after queen e7, which is a tricky move because if queen takes rook now, then the black knight has a discovered check. So the simplest and best thing to do is just capture the knight on e4 when white is a knight ahead. Again, let's go back. And after queen h5, black's best option right now is to play knight d6, protecting the f7 pawn and defending against the checkmate. If right now white would capture the pawn on e5, black would just block that check, pinning the white queen immediately, forcing the exchange of queens, and black would be just fine. Therefore, if white is trying to go for an advantage, should play bishop to b3. So at the moment, black is a pawn up, but black needs to be quite careful because white is better developed and is on the attack. In fact, playing the natural knight c6, which protects the pawn on e5, would be a mistake. In that case, white would continue with knight b5, trying to deflect the knight. If knight takes knight, obviously white checkmates right away on f7. And other than that, white is threatening to trade knights and then checkmate with queen takes f7. So black's best option right now is to play g6, forcing the queen back, but still maintaining the same threat. And now to play f5. Playing f6 is not as good because white would have an interesting opportunity in sacrificing the knight and then, after capturing on f6, trapping the rook in the corner. That's quite an interesting variation. However, black can and should, instead of playing f6, play f5 instead. And now white doesn't give up, still continues pursuing the same idea by playing queen to d5. Again, white wants to do the threat of the queen f7 checkmate. Again, knight is threatening to take on d6. So black plays queen e7, protecting the f7 square, but that means giving up on the rook in the corner. Knight c8, king d8, knight a8, and while it's true that black may trap the knight in the corner after b6, nevertheless white will be ahead after giving the knight up for the pawn on b6 when needed. Let's go back all the way to the very beginning. So we are looking at e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop c4, knight e4, and now the best move for white, queen h5, going for the attack. Knight d6, best move, bishop b3, and now we saw how knight c6 is not very good, and playing queen f6, protecting the pawn, would be even worse because white would have the opportunity to play knight d5 right away, not only attacking the queen, but again also attacking the pawn on c7. And if the queen retreats, then queen e5 obviously gives white a big advantage, as it would force the bishop to block, and then queen would be ready to capture on g7. Going back again to this position, after bishop b3, black's best option is to give the pawn back and play bishop to e7, trying to get ready to castle. And indeed, if white in this position would capture the pawn on e5 and let black castle and recuperate and then gain time to develop, then white really wouldn't have had achieved anything. White would have spent a number of moves with the queen just to win the pawn back. So therefore that wouldn't lead to any advantage for white, and the most challenging move for black to face right now is to play knight to f3, trying to continue with the attack. Let me show you how white's attack may develop if right now black continues with the most natural response, and that is to castle. Then, while white certainly could recapture the pawn on e5, that's not the most dangerous move from black's perspective, but it would be to play h4. A very interesting and somewhat unusual idea to immediately try to go for the attack, to try to play knight g5 on the next move, with the idea to checkmate. And if the bishop would capture, that knight when it gets to g5, then capture back with the h-pawn, and utilize the rook from the corner without ever making a move with it. Black has to be very careful right now. Here is a sample variation. If knight c6, white continues with knight g5. If h6, then white doesn't retreat but plays queen g6 with the idea to checkmate next on h7. Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes. It's true that black is surviving the attack, but nevertheless white wins the pawn back by playing knight d5, and white has a very strong attack going here. For example, after knight e8, white could just continue by playing d3 and then grabbing the pawn on g5. Well, let's go back to see the main line, what's best for black. After playing knight f3, instead of castling, it's more accurate from black's perspective to play knight c6 first. Right now, white can capture the pawn on e5. Another option is, which we'll see in our next game, white to play d3, which indeed leads to rather interesting game. So after knight e5, right now, black would have still difficulties if they would trade, castle, white's position would be still more active. However, black's best response after white captures the pawn on e5 in this position on move 7 is to play g6. If queen e2, then knight d4, and black can trade the knight for the bishop on b3. Or white's best response, knight c6, d takes, queen retreats, and finally black succeeds to castle. And when white castles, then plays knight f5, followed by knight d4 and trying to trade the knight for the bishop, and then eventually regrouping if needed the black bishop from e7 to g7 via the f6 square. Black has an equal position as theory has shown so far. And now let's see a classical game played by the former world champion Alexander Alekhine against Levitsky back in 1913, that is almost 100 years ago. Here we go. It started out the same exact way. e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop c4, black played knight e4, queen h5, knight d6, bishop b3, bishop e7, knight f3, knight c6, and now white did not capture on e5 but played d3. Now things are pretty interesting here and perhaps more challenging for black. Right now black continued by playing g6, which is considered as the best move. If black would castle right now, white could try similar ideas as we have seen before with h4 and knight g5. Came g6 and queen went back to h3. You may wonder how come not to h6, but the response to that would be the bishop retreating temporarily and then retreating to a more ideal square to g7. So queen moved to h3 and black played knight f5, trying to open up for the d pawn to move and also to control the h6 square. And now Alekhine played really energetically, and the thing is, in such situations, when you're already down a pawn, which white is in this case, you have to. Otherwise, black will just develop castle and be a pawn up, and it will be a matter of technique to win. So white needs to play aggressively. g4, very interesting move in chasing the knight away. Knight f to d4, and now came bishop h6 with the idea to play bishop g7, attacking the rook, and then grabbing the pawn on h7. Black captured, knight takes bishop, and white recaptured. This is one of the crucial moments of the game where Black needs to make a decision what to do. Black played f5 and we'll see how that panned out. A more solid and perhaps better way to play was to play rook to g8, preventing the bishop g7. Remember, Black is a pawn ahead, so all they need to do is survive the attack of White. Now, if the bishop would retreat to attack the pawn, Black could, of course, repeat moves and go back to h8, or could try to play bishop f6 with the idea that if now queen takes pawn on h7, then the rook would trap the queen right away. Of course, more challenging may be White playing g5, when Black could have an intermediate move, d5, queen h4, bishop retreats, takes. And it's true that White gained the pawn back. However, White will have to lose quite a few moves with the queen to get back to the game. In the meantime, Black succeeded to regroup, play d5. The other Black bishop is also ready to get out, and Black certainly has a decent game. Let's go back and see what happened after Black's response, which was f5 in this position. The idea is that if now pawn takes, then for Black to play d6, pinning that pawn on f5 and then capture back with the bishop, play queen d7 and castle to the queen's side. Of course, White foresaw that coming and therefore played the better bishop g7 as planned. Now the idea was that if rook moves to g8, then queen h7. However, Black had a different idea by first trading on g4. So now if queen takes back, then the rook already can move away without the dangers of losing the h7 pawn. But White did not give up on the idea and played queen h6. And Black played very creatively, pinning the bishop. Bishop f8, bishop takes, rook takes. The knight is now hanging, but it's moving to g5. As you can see, this is certainly a rather dangerous situation for the Black king. The White queen and two knights are on the attack. Came knight d4, knight h7. Now, not only that the rook on f8 is under attack, but so is the pawn on g6. Therefore, the rook had to move to g8, and White brought the other knight to the attack. So now there are some serious threats with either knight going to f6. Black went for hunting, going for the rook, and White, not rushing anything, simply recaptured, maintaining the attack full steam. Not much that Black can do against the upcoming check on f6. If king f7, then knight g5 check. Black played c6, knight f6, king f7, and knight g8. Now, of course, Black can capture either knight. Let's see what happens first if Black would have captured with a c-pawn. Then White would check, king f8, and while Black is up 2 pawns right now, White's attack is still rather strong. White could play, for example, f4 with the attempt to open up the f-file so the White rook can actively participate in the attack. For example, if en passant, check. If king takes knight, which is a mistake, then check, king f8, check, king e8, check, king f8, check. Now the king needs to move to e7 to protect the queen. Queen e5 check, king f7, queen h5, and finally the White rook will get the opportunity to come to the game with a check. For example, king g7, rook g1, and it's not hard to imagine why White is winning. In the game, in this position, Black has captured the other knight by playing queen g8. And now a fine move, knight b6, using the pin, rook b8, and knight c4. Very nice regrouping of the knight with new threats with checks on e5 or d6. If queen g7 now, the white queen would just retreat and white would win the pawn. Black continued with d6. White captured it. King e7. At this stage, white already is only one pawn down, but it's quite clear that the black pieces are discoordinated. Another pawn or two will fall, while white still has a very dangerous attack against black's king. Came knight c4, bishop f5, check, king e6. Now white could play rook e1 also, but Alekhine played queen e3, and only now rook e1, rook d8. And the key moment, very important, white does not want to trade queens, therefore captures on e5 with the knight, maintaining the attack against black's king. King f6, moving out of potential discovered checks. And this was the moment where white could have won quicker than they did in the game, although white's move, which was knight f7, also was good enough to win, but it was more accurate to actually capture the pawn on g4, followed by then queen e5, king f7, queen e7, and grabbing the rook with a check, followed by rook e7, and it's easy to understand why black is lost. If you're curious, this game is played by Alekhine against Levitsky, and you can find it in most chess databases. The game is played in 1913. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. In this very simple looking knight endgame, it seems that the game should be a draw as there is so little material left on the board. However, reality is white can move and win. Try to figure out where's the trick. And the brilliant solution is white can sacrifice the knight, and black here is helpless in catching the pawn from getting promoted. Quite amazing. Well, thank you so much for listening, and you certainly have a better idea now on what can happen after the starting moves that we saw in the Viennese. Even if you don't play this opening, I think this lesson was rather instructive in showing attacking and defensive possibilities in king-pawn openings and even just in general. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more interesting chess ideas. Bye-bye.